Okay, you guys. I wanted to make this video on rope anatomy and physiology. I've got my book here, Ashley's Book of Knots, which is considered the definitive knot Bible by most of the world, English-speaking world at least. Like, for instance, even here, one of the most popular apps for smartphones is this knot app called 3D Knots. And even right here on 3D Knots, here's the app right here, 3D Knots. It's a pretty good app. Here I'm giving them a free advertising. So let's go to my favorites. Here's the Alpine Butterfly. It's got I'll speed it up there. But even this knot, all the knots in here have an ABOK reference. ABOK is Ashley's Book of Knots. It's abbreviated. So right here, it says ABOK, ABOK, 1053. So if you go to knot 10, see, Ashley Book of Knot has something like 3,000 something knots in there. So there's like 3,000 knots, over 3,000 knots in that book. But this is knot number 1053. And all the knots, most knot books refer to ABOK, Ashley's Book of Knots, at least in America, you know. So, when people start talking about knots, you get really heated comments in the comment section. I like them because I like to listen to other people. I don't mind learning. But according to Ashley's Book of Knots, this is a turn. And some knot books say it's only a turn if it's going around a solid object. Like if I was going around a post, put my hand right here, going around a post or something. Then they say, okay, that's a turn. Or going around a stub or going around a wooden dowel. And if it's in the air, they call it a loop. Well, Ashley's Book of Knots does not call this a loop. On page 13 of Ashley's Book of Knots, that's where they talk about knot anatomy and physiology. On page 13, Ashley's Book of Knots. It's right there. Come on. And it's right here on page 13. I'll show it to you guys since you don't believe me. That's a bite. That right there is a loop. That right there is a closed loop. This right here is a turn. Diagram 40. That's a turn. That's a round turn. That's two round turns. So according to Ashley's Book of Knots, this is a turn all the time. Even if it's not around a solid object, still called a turn. A lot of modern knot books today are calling this a loop. But the old terminology called this a turn. And Wikipedia, for knot definition, uses Ashley's Book of Knots as a reference for defining knot terminology. It's still considered the empirical, more authoritative definition of knots. That book is referred to anyways. So I went to the Maritime School in the Bay Area in Vallejo. There's a maritime school. It's part of UC Berkeley, I think, or it's part of the Cal State system, education system. They have a merchant marine school there and everything, and they have a library, they have a campus and everything. And I went there and I said, hey, can I use your guys' library? And I was looking through all the books, and of course, a lot of the knot books are checked out because the type of people who check out knot books are the type of people who don't return them, right? I've always returned mine. But it's okay if you've done that. You should return those books, though. But I was trying to find books and look through them chronographically, like the oldest books to the newest books. And I was trying to find out, when did the terminology change? When did this start getting called a loop when this was originally called a turn? And when you know, we call this a bight. Most knot books, most modern knot books call this a bight, but Ashley's Book of Knots calls this a bight. Just a loose, sagging section of rope is called a bight. This is called a loop, and this is called a closed loop. But anyways, the here, I'll get around to this side so you can see better. If I'm going to tie a bowline, this is the way I tie a bowline. Cross over, make a circle, and now the knot is almost 3/4 of the way done. But if you look at the bowline, it's got a turn and a loop, which Ashley's Books of Knots calls a loop. That's a closed loop. This right here, that's a closed loop. This is a turn. So the only reason that I'm using Ashley's Book of Knots to define the terminology is just because it isn't because I just want to define the terminology. The point I'm trying to make is that almost all knots consist of turns and loops that are arranged in some sort of fashion. Like, for instance, the alpine butterfly. It's a whole bunch of turns. This is the way I like to tie it. Make 3 turns over your hand, and then you put the first one over, the second one over, and the second one goes over all of them and through the middle. And there's your butterfly, your alpine butterfly knot. It says make it dressed so it looks good. There. And it's a bunch of, this right here is a loop. It's a closed loop. And you got a turn here and a turn here. An overhand knot. You're just basic granny knot. That's a one turn with the rope passed through the eye of the turn, thus creating a constriction. And this is the third anatomical shape that I find in knots, is what I call a twist, but to Ashley's Book of Knots, it's actually called an elbow. But Ashley's Book of Knot actually shows, you know, when ropes get twisted together like this, like anchor ropes, and one anchor's going this way, and one, you have 2 bow anchors, say, and they're anchored on the deck up, they're fastened on the deck up here, and then the boat turns. If the boat turns in the wind and goes around, you'll get a twist. But that they call that an elbow. An elbow. But when I take a rope and go like this, I call that a twist. But technically, I guess I should call it an elbow. And one commenter made that comment that it's not a twist, that's an elbow. And I looked it up and I was like, well, the elbow in Ashley's Book of Knots is more like this, like when 2 anchor lines run afoul of each other and they go like that. That's an elbow. But just for the sake of being correct, from now on, I'm just going to call those elbows. So those are the 3 shapes that are in all knots. The turn, the closed loop, or the loop, and an elbow. An overhand knot has kind of an elbow in it. The rope is starting to make an elbow and goes around. Let's see, the figure 8. Is 2 turns. You got a turn going counterclockwise, and then you've got a turn going clockwise. A turn going counterclockwise, a turn going clockwise. If I tie this rope to this rope, that's a sheet bend. This is a turn, this is a loop. So almost all the knots that I can think of, you know, even the slip knot, that has a loop and a turn. A loop and a turn. So those are the 3 basic shapes that are in all knots. The ones that you notice the most in all knots, they somehow incorporate the shape of a turn. and a loop. They're in almost every knot that I've ever seen. Every single knot that I've tied. Let's see, what other kind of knots do I know right now off the top of my head? Well, there's the clove hitch. See, this is a fast way of tying a clove hitch I learned. Is you take this hand and invert it upside down completely, so your pinky's up, and then take this hand with your palm open, facing they're facing opposite each other, and then I just take and invert them like that. Take your hand and just go like that. Boom, you got a clove hitch right there. So you just take the rope, go like that. Boom, you got a clove hitch right there. That's 2 turns. Clove hitch fastened on my hand. But anyways, I just wanted to show that basic concept, and you can chew on that for a while. Okay, there you go, you guys. The Ashley Book of Knots by Clifford W. Ashley. I think this book was written in 1944. Page 13. This page right here has all the rope anatomy and terminology. The end, the bite, the standing part, the bite, the loop, the closed loop, the cross, the elbow, that's an anchor front of a boat. The anchor lines coming down, they get a twist in them like that, where they're pulling. That's an elbow. And here's the turn, the round turn, and 2 round turns. It's all there, page 13. That is considered the standard for knot definition, is Ashley's Book of Knots. Everybody uses it.